Hello, everyone, and welcome to Global Minnesota's Great Conversations for the month of February. Our program tonight, the Coldest War Great Power Competition in the Arctic, was of course perfectly timed for the end of our Arctic period of this winter here in Minnesota. But we know there are people watching from all over the planet, probably not facing the Arctic conditions, but people who are very interested in what is happening to this very unique and very special part of the planet, a part of the planet that I was fortunate enough to visit and to work in when I was much, much younger. My name is Mark Ritchie, and I have the honor of serving as president of Global Minnesota. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, 70 years old this year, whose mission is advancing international understanding and engagement. And we do that by connecting people, Minnesotans to the world to Minnesota. And now, thanks to the magic of Zoom and digital platforms, we're able to connect everybody on the planet on these topics of global interest like the Arctic. These programs are possible and free to the public because of the contributions of our generous supporters and for the contributions of all of you who have become members of Global Minnesota over the years. Your membership helps to keep these programs going, and we do them in partnership with partners that have been very, very important over the years when we were able to meet in person. The Minneapolis Central Library and Friends of the Hennepin County Library and the Landmark Center in St. Paul. We look forward to the days when we can again offer in-person programming. But for now, we're seeing the opportunities and we're taking advantage of the ability to be truly global and also to reach every corner of the state of Minnesota. Many of the topics that we speak about and bring in expert presenters, we draw from the Great Conversations policy program of the Foreign Policy Association Great Decisions national program that they offer. Discussion groups all over the country looking at 8 or 9 important foreign policy topics each year. These are held in schools and churches and home, but we partner here in the Twin Cities area with the Edina Senior Center, Friends of the Edina Library, the Washburn Library, and the Plymouth Library, and they're our partners for the program this evening. We're very fortunate tonight to welcome as our guest speaker, Heather Conley, who's the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She served in many different roles in the public and private sector, 4 years as Executive Director of the Office of the Chairman of the Board of the American Red Cross, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, with responsibility for relations, the bilateral relations with the countries of Northern and Central Europe. I believe she ended her foreign policy career in the US Embassy there in Helsinki in Finland. But she began her career in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. I have the honor of serving as Minnesota's civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army. And in that position, I'm very aware of how important it is, how crucial it is that our diplomatic wing of our government, our military and security wings, that all of the pieces of our institutions of public service know and work together well, and they are staying abreast of the issues that are emerging. Few issues have emerged with such a kind of speed and in intensity as what is happening in the Arctic. We'll hear tonight about some of the reasons why that change and that acceleration of interest has occurred. We're very, very fortunate to be able to welcome to our program tonight, Heather Conley. Heather, please join me on the Zoom screen. Thank you very much again. I'm turning it over to you.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you so much to Global Minnesota for this kind invitation. I always like to joke when I begin my Arctic presentation, I always welcome our audience to join me and go to the Arctic with me. I feel like right now for most of the United States, the Arctic has come to us. But in any event, what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is really take you through some of the major trends, the opportunities and the challenges that are in the Arctic. This power presentation is really to show you those pictures. The Arctic is such a visual story. It's such a compelling story. And then when we're finished with this tour, this geopolitical tour of the Arctic, I look forward to my discussion with John and receiving your questions. So Tim, let's go to the first slide, please. So before we start embark on our Arctic journey, it's really essential for you to get your mental map. So often when I talk to American audiences about the Arctic, it's really hard. We see Alaska far, far away from the continental US. It's not really the right way to look at the Arctic. You have to sort of look down and think about the North Pole as being at the center. And that changes your perspective completely. I want you to look at Russia. Look how large Russia is. It is the largest Arctic coastal state. Russia has over 51% of the Arctic coastline. Look how large Canada is. That is the Canadian archipelago, a very strong Arctic nation and its Arctic identity. Look at the Kingdom of Denmark from Greenland. We don't often call Denmark the Kingdom of Denmark, but you have to, because Greenland is a part of the kingdom where Greenland, under home rule, controls the economic fortunes of Greenland, but Denmark, Copenhagen, controls foreign and security policy. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about China's investment. Now look at Alaska, look at the United States. That's a pretty small piece of Arctic real estate. But I want you to focus in, before we leave this map, the very narrow space between Russia and the United States, Alaska. That's the Bering Strait. And if there's a lot of additional commercial shipping and traffic that will travel through those very narrow straits, the United States and Russia have a very large border, a maritime border that they have to manage responsibly, even when tensions are high between our countries. So before we leave this map, let me just share, there are 5 Arctic coastal states. Of course, Russia, the United States, Canada, Denmark because of Greenland, and Norway. So we call those the Arctic 5. Just remember, those are the 5 coastal states. But we have Finland, Sweden, and Iceland. They don't have Arctic coastline, but of course, Finland and Sweden have territory within the Arctic Circle, and Iceland just barely misses that definition. So the 8 countries, the 5 coastal states, plus Finland, Sweden, and Iceland, they constitute the membership of an organization I'll tell you a little bit more about, the Arctic Council, and we call them the Arctic 8. So you have your mental map, keep that picture in mind as we talk about the important trends of the Arctic. Next slide, please. So you cannot begin a conversation about the geopolitics of the Arctic without understanding our history. So these 2 photos in some ways are the most, sort of recent modern history of the United States really understanding why the Arctic is so important to US national security and defense. So the picture to my left, the Murmansk supply lines. So during the Second World War, the Soviet Union was an important ally of the United States and the Allied powers. It was vital to keep the Soviet Union in that battle. We had to keep them supplied. So one of the most vital shipping routes was Allied supply routes to Murmansk, Russia. Incredible heroism, incredible stories. So we understood what makes the Arctic so strategic is it shortens the time and distance, it shortens supply lines, it shortens communication lines. So that we understood how important that was for keeping and sustaining the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Now, the other picture is actually about territorial defense of eventually, when Alaska joined the United States officially, US territory. And that was the defense of the Aleutian Islands from Japanese attack and invasion. We then began to understand how important that, that chain represented to US national security. So shortening distances and defending the United States, those are two themes that will continue to echo their importance today. Next slide, please. So at the end of the Second World War, of course, and as the Cold War began, we continued to understand the strategic imperative of the Arctic. Of course, President Eisenhower and the Eisenhower administration began to build a missile defense shield, if you will, that first shield, the distant early warning line or DEW line. Again, it's architecture. I will show you pictures of it today. It exists. It was about detecting early warning signals of Soviet attack. Of course, our ally swiftly became our adversary. But it was the same arc in the same geography of the North, because that was how the Soviet Union could reach the United States very quickly, either from bombers, air capabilities, or submarine capabilities. So with Canada, the North American air defense, what we call NORAD today, still stands very much. So we continue to understand why the Arctic was so important to protecting the United States. Next slide, please. And again, let me show you the modern strategic imperative of the Arctic. So today, this picture to your left is in Alaska, Fort Greely. That is where some of our most advanced missile defense interceptors are based. Much of that force is to detect and, hopefully never have to shoot down North Korean missiles. And that picture to your right is the most northerly US Air Force base in the world, Thule Air Force Base in Greenland. Again, these were part and parcel of important strategic locations during the Cold War. Remember that picture of Greenland that I showed you? This is where the US can protect the avenues of approach to the United States through the North Atlantic. So again, you're seeing where that history turned into our modern day protection of the United States through missile defense and early warning of missile defense, of missiles coming to the United States. Next slide, please. So that was your history lesson of why the Arctic was so important to US national security. But let me tell you why we are talking about the Arctic today in such urgent and strident terms. And that is because we are seeing some of the most profound environmental transformation anywhere in the world. The Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than any place in the world. And so you can see on the picture, again, to my right, of the summer Arctic Sea. And Mark, you were stepping your toe into some of that cold, cold water when you were swimming in the Barents Sea as a young man. But what's so remarkable about the environmental transformation in the maritime space is the great diminishment of the polar ice cap. So that picture in red of the outline used to be how thick and expansive the Arctic polar ice cap was in 1979. That picture that you're seeing of the white today is the present ice cap. Now, again, every year this changes. Sometimes we have an extremely diminished polar ice cap due to weather conditions and other anomalies. Sometimes it's a little bit more expansive, but it has shrunk dramatically. So this ice is unlike the previous ice cap. It's very thin. It's called young ice. So when we have severe storms in the Arctic, this ice can break, it can shift, it can be very, very unpredictable. Now, the difference here, some people confuse this, and it's very easy to confuse it. The diminishment of the polar ice cap does not do anything to affect sea level rise. The picture to my left of the Greenland ice sheet, that is what impacts sea level rise. So this vast glacier, this vast ice sheet sitting on Greenland has been rapidly shrinking. And that is what is calving and going into the Atlantic and melting and causing sea level rise. So these two phenomena are in part some of the most significant transformation that we're seeing. And the reason that the United States is experiencing, in part, we believe, and there's a lot of questions about exactly what is happening. The diminishment of the polar ice cap has affected the jet stream and this what is called an Arctic oscillation belt. It swirls around the North Pole. When it shrinks, it weakens, that the jet stream starts to weaken, and then it starts to get very wavy and it starts to dip. And it can allow that very cold polar temperatures to plunge into the United States. This is in part what we're seeing today. So there's a really direct relationship to the Arctic environmental transformation and to what we are experiencing in our weather patterns today. So this is a perfect example. We don't know completely why it's changing this way, but this is certainly where a majority of scientists believe the shrinking of the polar ice cap is having an immediate effect on our weather patterns. Next slide, please. So this isn't the issue on the polar ice cap. We are seeing very profound changes in the Arctic Ocean itself. So that picture to the left, the algae bloom, again, as Arctic waters warm, the plankton and other things are allowed to start to emerge. And then we see fishing stocks starting to go towards cooler waters. And of course, algae blooms can potentially be productive for fishing stocks, but on the other hand, they can destroy very productive fishing stocks as well, depending on the toxicity of that algae bloom. So in some ways, this sort of sees the shifting patterns of both plankton and fishing stocks. It also can be very toxic for very productive fishing areas. The other picture is ocean acidification. This is where that carbon dioxide is mixing. It's changing the composition of the ocean waters. Again, this is very harmful to fishing stocks. Another phenomenon we're seeing worldwide, but we're seeing it particularly in the Arctic, is microplastics. As the currents are taking them, they're finding them going into a very strong presence in the Arctic. So lots of difficult changes. Of course, we know indigenous communities rely on mammals and fishing stocks for their food security, their livelihood. So these dramatic changes are really impairing indigenous communities for their sustenance and their fishing and hunting grounds. Next slide, please. As I said, there is sort of the crisis of this environmental transformation and the challenge, but there is also opportunity. And so, as I mentioned, as those fishing stocks move north for cooler waters, we're seeing an extraordinary abundance, particularly in the Bering Sea, and that's near the Barents Sea in Norway, but we're also seeing some of that fishing stock enhancement in the Bering Sea off of Alaska. When we could travel pre-pandemic, more and more people wanted to take those cruises through the Canadian Northwest Passage or try to reach the North Pole if they could. So we're seeing increased human activity. We're seeing increased fishing stocks. Next slide, please. And of course, when you have a diminishing polar ice cap and a receding ice picture, now we have the potential to dramatically shorten shipping distances between Asia and Europe and North America. So all those squiggly lines that you see to the left, the three main squiggly lines, to use a technical term there, are the major transportation routes across the Arctic Ocean. So the one that's most heavily used, that's right above Russia, is called the Northern Sea Route. This is going to be the one that's probably the most commercially viable. It is where the ice has receded the most, and it is where Russia wants, in the words of Vladimir Putin, to create the next Suez Canal. He foresees a very heavy commercial use of the Northern Sea Route. The lines that go through the Canadian archipelago to your far left, That's, of course, the Northwest Passage. That route probably will not be used as much, very little. Number one, it's very little infrastructure. The ice clogging there makes it very difficult to use. And it's just probably not going to be the most viable commercial route. That big red line that you see right across the middle is really the route of the future. That's the transpolar route. This is the route that the Chinese are particularly interested in. They don't necessarily want to go through the Russian Arctic and use Russian icebreakers or have to pay for those services. What they'd like to do is go right across the Arctic and then deliver to ports in Europe, Iceland, and other access points. It could potentially shrink shipping times between Asia and Europe by 30%. There's a lot of ifs to that, because if weather is good, if there's no delays or problems, but this would be something that could potentially be viable in the 2040, 2050 timeframe. Every year, China sends a cargo container ship for that transpolar route. They're continuing to test to see if it's viable. And we'll talk a bit about what China is thinking about the Arctic, but this is certainly one. Shipping is a major interest because China would like to send its exports as quickly as possible in multiple ways around the world. It also would like to receive energy resources, and we'll talk about that in a second. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the picture to your right, the Yamal liquefied natural gas project. This is perhaps the most important and exciting energy development in the Russian Arctic. And it's being constructed and built with participation by certainly Chinese energy firms. So this project, what makes liquefied natural gas so interesting is that it can be shipped, and it can go either east into China, into Asian markets, or it can go west and it can supply European markets. Even the United States has received liquefied natural gas from the Yamal Peninsula, so is the United Kingdom. Energy is a hugely important story for Russia. Again, the U.S. Geological Survey in a 2008 report surmises that up to 30% of the world's natural gas could be found in the Arctic. Upwards of 12 to 13% of oil could be found there. The oil and gas is believed to be concentrated in the exclusive economic zones of either Russia, Norway, or the United States. So there's not a dispute about who owns those resources. It's all about whether we should develop them. And we'll talk a little bit about the future of energy extraction in the Arctic. But Russia is counting on the Arctic being their new supply of energy. As their Siberian fields are exhausted, they really see this as the future for Russia's energy-based economy. But China also sees great opportunity. They want some of those energy supplies to diversify their own interests. And what the picture you're seeing to the left is actually the first Chinese icebreaker. They have now constructed their second icebreaker. This is the Zhuilong. They've constructed the Zhuilong 2, and they have announced that they are building a nuclear propelled icebreaker. And so China sees these icebreakers as important to their enhancing their scientific presence in the Arctic, but they're interested in that shipping. And icebreakers really allow Arctic highways, if you will, in the maritime sense, to be used. So we see where icebreaking capabilities, shipping, energy, those are two really important economic opportunities that countries are eager to exploit. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk a little bit about international law. So you might have seen headlines or seen the race for resources or concerns of the Russians planting a flag underneath the seabed, underneath the North Pole. Those are very stark images. But right now, the Arctic is very well governed using the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea Treaty. Remember, I told you about those 5 coastal states. Those 5 coastal states have a ton of international legal law that governs their territorial waters, their exclusive economic zones, which stretches to 200 nautical miles. And then, of course, around the North Pole, those are international waters. That's the Central Arctic Ocean. And so everyone respects that. The United States has not ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty. I wish we would. I hope we will. But we treat it as international customary law. The other Arctic states have ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty. Now, the one thing you might see in future headlines is that the Russians have submitted scientific claims to extend their outer continental shelf. This is when you supply the scientific data and see if it meets the legal definition. Russia's claims are extensive. They would take pretty large swaths of the seabed near and around the North Pole. But Russia is following international law. This is not a cause for concern, but it's something to monitor because other countries like Denmark and Canada have competing claims. Unfortunately, the United States cannot submit its scientific claims to extend its outer continental shelf because we have failed to ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty. So something to watch as far as future claims to extend the outer continental shelf of the coastal states. Next slide, please. Now, let me talk a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the ocean and the importance of the maritime space. But as I mentioned about Greenland and the diminishment of the Greenland ice sheet, we are seeing profound changes on land. And so the pictures that you are seeing are caused by permafrost thaw to your left. So buildings, roads, pipelines are collapsing. In fact, last fall, Russia experienced a massive diesel spill, 21,000 tons of diesel spilt into a very ecologically sensitive area near Norilsk, Russia, because a fuel tanker basically shifted and collapsed because it was built on permafrost thaw. And so this is a massive issue that is challenging every Arctic nation, particularly Russia. Again, when you have the most Arctic territory, you're going to suffer, you're going to get the benefits, obviously, from the economic opportunity, but you're really going to suffer from the transformation. The other picture is coastal erosion. So in the United States, FEMA is having to, and the Department of Homeland Security is having to relocate coastal villages. Their villages are so close to the water because, again, subsistence hunting and fishing, they are near their food sources. Their villages are literally collapsing into the ocean because of coastal erosion. So when that ice recedes and those storms come in, the ice used to serve as a buffer. There's no more buffer. You add that to permafrost thaw, and you're literally seeing these villages collapse into the ocean. So these are just some examples of environmental challenge. We're also seeing the release of methane as the permafrost thaws. In Russia, they have had anthrax scares because of what is being released from when the permafrost thaws. We're seeing wildfires, tundra fires, because as the permafrost thaws, the material dries and is very susceptible to fires. So huge environmental challenges as we see this transformation take place. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the history, we've talked about the environmental change, the economic opportunities. So let me tell you a little bit about how the international community is trying to manage all of these incredible changes and challenges. Well, they create intergovernmental forums like the Arctic Council. So the Arctic Council is made up of those 8 Arctic states that I outlined to you at the beginning of the talk. But what makes the Arctic Council so unique and important is that in addition to the 8 states, it has at the table representatives of the indigenous communities named the permanent participants. So the human dimension here is really important. There are 4 million people that live in the Arctic. We have major urban centers in the European and Russian Arctic, certainly not the case in the North American Arctic, where it's very sparsely populated. But it's important to make sure that we keep the indigenous communities very, very much part of the discussions that we're having on sustainable development and environmental protection and mitigation. So the Arctic Council has done great work since 1996 in focusing on environmental protection and sustainable development. Another unique feature of the Arctic Council is it brings in a lot of observer nations like China, like India, like Italy, like Korea, like Germany. It's a very eclectic group of states, but also observing organizations like the World Wildlife Fund. So it's a unique body that's doing great environmental impact assessments and work. The other innovation, and this is a picture of, I hate to say it, the only functioning US icebreaker in our inventory. This is the Polar Star. This is the one heavy icebreaker that the US has. The other icebreaker that we have is a medium icebreaker, medium strength icebreaker. It's used for science. Unfortunately, last summer it had a catastrophic fire and is being repaired right now. So we share the Polar Star between the South Pole, Antarctica, and the Arctic. It was built in the 1970s, and we're hoping it lasts a little bit longer. But icebreakers, we can talk about that in the Q&A, certainly something that the United States could use a few more of. But the Polar Star, what that represents is the Arctic Council members, the states, formed an Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which is a great idea as we help to figure out how we can collectively do search and rescue, oil spill response. We know the commercial and the human activity is increasing in the Arctic. We are going to need all the Coast Guards and the navies of the Arctic coastal states to participate and work together. And so that's a really important collaborative effort. A little fun fact, probably the best relationship we have functionally in the Arctic is the US Coast Guard and the Russian Federal Security Bureau, or FSB. The Coast Guard and the FSB manage that narrow Bering Strait, and they work together to prevent illegal fisheries. They work together to make sure that if there is a problem with a vessel, that it can be rescued. So there's some good news that's coming out of the Arctic and collaboration and international cooperation. Next slide, please. But it's not all sunny and rosy. So let's talk about, so I always like to start with the optimistic part where we're partnering successfully with Russia and working in the Bering Strait region. But there's a lot to be concerned about what Russia is doing militarily in the Arctic. So these are two pictures. Mr. Putin is looking after one of the, or overseeing one of the many Russian military exercises that take place in the Arctic. The other picture is looking at a Russian submarine. So about 12 years ago, Russia really, in some ways, had a strategic awakening of the importance of the Arctic. At the end of the Cold War, in some ways very similar to the US, we didn't have to sustain all of that hardware in the Arctic. We were working together collaboratively, and a lot of the Russian bases across their vast coastline, they fell into repair. They had population losses. They were struggling economically. So really there wasn't anything happening. But around 2007, 2008, when Mr. Putin started to work on rebuilding the Russian military and wanted to be treated with respect as a global and great power, he began to rebuild Russia's military presence in the Arctic. There's a lot of good reason why Russia is building military capabilities in the Arctic, because they have such an ambitious economic vision. Again, the Suez Canal in the Arctic, you need to have search and rescue centers. You need to make sure you have radar and you know the vessels that are coming in to the Russian Arctic. So some of this is completely understandable. But some of it, particularly Russia's military development that is closer to the Norwegian border, that is close to NATO, that has nothing to do with the economic ambitions of Russia. That has all to do with confrontation with the United States and NATO. It's about, in some ways, rekindling Russia's muscle memory from the Cold War. So we're seeing a dramatic uptick in Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic. That is why the United States reconstituted the Second Fleet in Norfolk, Virginia, to continue to monitor that. We're seeing where Russia is reopening upwards of 50 airfields and bases across the vast Russian Arctic. They're putting pretty sophisticated aircraft. They're testing new weapons and new missiles, and they are exercising this repeatedly. So they're definitely signaling to us that the Arctic is very important to them. And they want to understand that, again, like during the Cold War, that they will defend certainly their nuclear deterrent, which is based in the Arctic on the Kola Peninsula. So something to watch here very, very clearly. Next slide, please. And again, these are just other pictures of their new military installations. That picture to your left is called the trefoil. These are new modern troop housing facilities on very distant Arctic islands. And we're seeing a lot of use of special forces and new equipment that is designed for war fighting in the Arctic. So this is just, again, they're showing us a lot of capabilities in the Arctic. Next slide, please. And again, this is a picture. CSIS has done a lot of studying of Russia's military modernization in the Arctic. Again, this just shows you the significance of their pattern across the Russian coastline. Next slide, please. Again, more pictures. This is satellite imagery, actually, of radar, newly placed radar. Wrangel Island is 300 nautical miles away from Alaska. And by 2022, Alaska will have the highest concentration of US aircraft capabilities in the world. Again, it's all about shortening distances. And so some of this is obviously keeping some eyes on that, but we're also seeing the development of new basing, more sophisticated combat aircraft and airfields that are a little closer to NATO territory. And that's the Conley Island picture. Next slide, please. So in my last few minutes before we turn to Q&A, I want to talk a little bit about China's footprint in the Arctic. We talked about China's ice-breaking capability. Certainly, they are also very interested in scientific exploration. China has new research centers in Northern Iceland, in Norway, even they've opened one recently in Russia. But China is also pursuing a lot of economic opportunities in Arctic states. This is a picture of the potential of China building 3 airports in Greenland. And why would China be interested in Greenland? A couple of reasons. Greenland has rare earth minerals. So China has certainly been keen to invest in mineral mining in Greenland. Greenland, again, why we have an American air base, it's location. And they do see the strategic interest. If that transpolar route becomes a possibility, they will want ports, they will want facilities to bring those commodities and products and distribute them across Europe. But this caught the attention of the United States when China wanted to build infrastructure in Greenland. Of course, there was concern about Thule Air Force Base. And of course, there was concern about China's economics and how often their economic projects have what we call dual use. So they can have military capabilities as well. Well, the United States was spurred into action, working with the Danish government. Denmark became the contributor to building those airports eventually. And of course, we all remember President Trump's very famous tweet that he was quite interested in buying Greenland. And the Danish prime minister quickly said, it's not for sale, but it's open for business. But we want to make sure we know what business is coming in because it's so strategically important to the United States. So we're watching China as they're seeking to build undersea cables from the Arctic to Asia. Again, shortening distances, information. If you can get information a second faster because of an undersea cable, you have an advantage. Of course, there's surveillance implications there as well. We're focusing on China's port infrastructure across the Arctic, building railroads. Again, we're very concerned about Russia and China working together, joining forces, and what the implications will be for the United States if they see their economic and security benefits of China and Russia working together. So next slide, please. Lots of things to talk about, and this is just a site. We have lots of reports and commentaries on our Arctic research, and we certainly invite you at your leisure to take a look at those if you find those helpful. So with that, I will stop, and I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that big picture, the history, those incredible photographs, but also bringing us up to date and talking about some of those very special features around that geopolitical circle that you introduced us to right in the beginning. I'm really pleased and very honored to be able to bring our next guest up, the moderator for this evening, John Olson, a retired commander in the U.S. Navy and now a guest lecturer on international security and national security affairs. Graduated from the Naval Academy in Annapolis and Minneapolis native. Served in Naval Office Intelligence Service, retiring in March in 2011. He's served duty all over the planet, and we're so grateful to have him and his expertise here. And I hope he'll tell us a little more about his weekly National Security This Week radio program. Welcome, John.
Mark, thank you for that kind introduction. And Heather, I'm very excited to have this short discussion with you. We've got about 15 minutes or so that we can address a couple of important questions. So let's jump right into it because I want our audience to hear some of this. How comfortable are you talking about sort of, this is a great power competition discussion tonight. How comfortable are you talking about sort of the balance of power in the military forces in the Arctic between the U.S., Russia, maybe Canada, and the other Arctic nations?
Yes, you know, it's been very interesting to watch the evolution of U.S. policy towards the Arctic. I would say, you know, during the Obama administration, the focus on the Arctic was really all about the urgency of climate change, that the Arctic in some ways just absolutely represented how critical it was to begin to manage and mitigate that environmental transformation. And unfortunately, we just weren't able to focus as much as I think we should have as Russia began to shift its posture in the Arctic. Of course, we want the Arctic to remain a place of peace and cooperation and stability. That's all of our mutual goals. But I think we failed to appreciate important shifts were starting to happen. When the Trump administration came on board and then developed a national security strategy that looked at great power competition, that said Russia and China are our near peer military competitors, and we have to shift in our thinking. It took a little while, but eventually our national defense strategy and a lot of the military services started to use that framework, and then they were applying it to the Arctic. And so I would argue, though, that the great power competition is not, both China and Russia have strong interests in the Arctic, but they're not the same. And I think in some ways, the Trump administration got a little too focused, I think, on China's role in the Arctic, which certainly has emerged. It has called itself in its strategic documents a near Arctic state. It is not a near Arctic state. It has said that, you know, we're not quite sure it's undetermined sovereignty in the Arctic. Of course, it is clear the law of the sea provides all the sovereignty and the legal framework that we need. China right now is focusing on the economics of the Arctic, as I said, shipping and fishing and energy and the science, because of course the climate is impacting, the Arctic is impacting China in the mid latitudes as well. So they have absolutely every right. They're an observer of the Arctic Council. But what concerns me right now, which I think we need to refocus ourselves, is Russia and their military positioning and what they're demonstrating to us. They're signaling to us through exercises, through long-range bombers, through their submarine activity. They're signaling to us that you know, they want to protect the Russian Arctic, but this is a little aggressive. And so this has required NATO and the United States to also demonstrate that it has some capabilities in the Arctic. The problem is the United States has a lot of competing interests, and our military would like to focus keep us focused on the challenge that China presents in the Indo-Pacific. And the Arctic is a tough place to allocate resources, build those icebreakers, have ice-strengthened naval vessels. We don't have any currently in the Navy's inventory. So we're trying to work with our allies, demonstrate we have reach and capabilities in the Arctic, but I think we have to take this Russia challenge a little bit more seriously than we have. I fear it's destabilizing. So focus on Russia, keep a close eye on China, build up American capabilities, and work closely with our allies. I think that will be the ticket.
Let's talk a little bit more about the icebreaker issue. You mentioned that Polar Star is really the only operational icebreaker that we have in the inventory, and it's a Coast Guard vessel. You talked about the U.S. Navy wanting to look into hardening some of our U.S. Navy ships for it. What is the disparity between Russia, Canada, and the United States with regards to icebreakers, total numbers?
Okay, let me first caveat say it's not fair to compare numbers. So if Russia has 51% of the coastline, they need to have a larger icebreaker fleet. But I do, if we were in a live presentation, I would ask our audience, here's your quiz. How many icebreakers does the greatest maritime power in the world possess, the United States? Typically, I say 1.5, one for the Polar Star and a half for the Healy, which is the medium strengthened icebreaker. But now we have one, and that one is basically, it stays in Antarctica to resupply our research station in Antarctica. It's really not very present in the Arctic very often. In fact, COVID has actually, because we can't supply the research station in Antarctica, it's actually freed it for the Arctic, which is great. The United States has had to borrow other nations' icebreaking capabilities just to do science. Now, the good news is we are procuring and building in the United States, in Mississippi, a new icebreaker. But that icebreaker probably won't be ready until 2024. Things usually slip, so maybe we say 2025. We may not have icebreaking capability because the Polar Star was built in the 1970s. Last year, it had 2 catastrophic mechanical failures. They have to go on eBay to buy parts for that thing because it just doesn't exist anymore. We can do better than that. The problem is we are really far behind. It's going to take a while for us to even build, replace what we have, not build beyond that. So Canada is going to be very important to the United States. They are building Arctic patrol vessels. We are going to have to work together with our allies in Finland and Sweden that have more capabilities. But again, that's not often what you think of the United States relying on its allies for its capabilities. Usually it's the other way around. I feel that this is something that unfortunately we needed to deal with a decade ago. We all said, oh yes, we'll study it, or it's just too expensive. Well, we're really paying for that lack of foresight here.
So you mentioned some of the science of climate change and impacts on the Arctic. I was naval attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki from 2008 to 2011. And even back then, I was attending a lot of different lectures that were oceanography related that talked about the changing climate and how it would impact the Arctic, how it would melt that multi-year ice into one-year ice, and you covered that really well in your lecture. The feedback loop that we're seeing really impact the Arctic now. Are there estimates that you may have seen that are talking about how quickly we're going to see the polar sea route actually open up and be available for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 months out of the year? What are we really looking at there?
Thank you, John. It's a great question. I think, again, I try to understand and follow the scientific literature as best I can. I am not a climatologist. I'm not a scientist, but what's been surprising to me is all the modeling, all the predictions have been wrong about the Arctic because it's moved so fast. So where we thought we would be in 2021 is so much faster. So this has really confounded the scientists, to your point, that they fear that we are at this moment, this inflection moment where this cycle now, you can't stop it, even if every nation today would decide to keep, do massive environmental mitigation, carbon emission reduction, would try to change it, it couldn't stop it because it's now moved the past where, because the ocean waters are warming. And again, why the polar ice cap is melting, the waters are warmer underneath it. So it's melting it below. And then you have this phenomena called black carbon. So that's sort of, think of it as like dirt or soot that is brought from industrial pollution and winds. And that black soot sits on top of the ice, which attracts the sun and warms it. So it's being warmed from the top, it's being warmed from the bottom, and that's what's accelerating the polar ice caps diminishment. It is shifting the salt and the fresh water, this ocean acidification is changing and altering the actual ocean itself. So it's really happening faster than we had ever anticipated it would. So right now we are seeing across the Russian Arctic and the Northern Sea route, in fact, what we call the shoulder season, which means, there's a few summer months when you can ship, Alaska, Canada, everyone uses those summer seasons to do barge traffic and to do resupply. That season is starting to stretch. Now, our Russian colleagues have a risk appetite that's a little more than I think we could stomach. They sometimes push this well into November to December, and then they have terrible accidents because of that risk-taking behavior. So we're already seeing the length of it increase. Are we seeing an increase in shipping traffic? Not really. And so this is the big question mark. So as much as there might be great economic opportunity for the Arctic as shipping routes become more viable, really, so goes the Arctic, so goes the global economy. When commodities like energy and minerals, iron, zinc, palladium, all the 21st century minerals that we need, rare earths, when those prices are high, the Arctic becomes a little bit more economically viable. When energy prices plummet or when the economy stumbles, no one really uses this. So there's real questions of whether Russia's very ambitious economic plans are even viable. And so this sets off another series of questions. If Russia has bet everything on the future of the Arctic and it can't develop it, and if we globally transition away from fossil fuels, which we are slowly doing, investors don't want to invest in Arctic exploration because it's controversial in their state. Their shareholders say, I don't want to contribute to climate change. You are seeing where people don't want fossil fuels. So the entire sort of raison d'etre for Arctic economic development is being profoundly questioned right now, in part because the climate impacts are so severe that it's stopping people from wanting to invest in additional fossil fuels, particularly based in the Arctic.
You actually beat me to the punch because I was going to bring up that unique situation there where Russia is investing so heavily in fossil fuel development in that region, and the entire world needs to turn the corner on fossil fuels to walk it back so that whole area refreezes to get us back into a normal climate cycle. And as you mentioned, we are already going to see climate change impacts that are going to last for a few decades at least, even if we turned everything off today. So some of the things that you talked about a little bit were the indigenous communities that live along the coastlines and the impacts that they've had from coastal erosion, and then the fact that the permafrost is melting. How is that impacting sort of the Arctic Council policy development to try and address those things in an integrated way across all of these unique cultures that exist up in the high north?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And I always, because I so frequently talk about the geopolitics of the Arctic and Russia's military modernization and China's footprint, sometimes it's easy to sort of forget that this has to be a people-centric approach. And indigenous communities' way of life are so deeply challenged. The mental health challenges, the fact that there's food insecurity, even fresh water is becoming a challenge, and they are seeing in real time the impact of climate change. that what I'm so appreciative of the Arctic Council is they do have the permanent participants, the Indigenous communities are engaged. The problem is this problem is so massive and so overwhelming. I have participated in a lot of conferences on the Arctic, and you have a handful of incredible Indigenous leaders that are being stretched 1,000 ways. Okay, we need to participate in a meeting of foreign ministers. We need to, ensure that there's economic opportunity for our young people. We need to make sure that we are being heard internationally. They are so stretched. They are, being approached by countries like China that are willing to give these Indigenous communities vast sums of money, but perhaps to sway them to support a Chinese investment. So we've got to monitor that closely. So we really need to support the Indigenous communities. They're under great strain and stress. And I think focusing some of our efforts even on Alaska, that we have Americans that are in absolute dire need. They don't have indoor plumbing. Their traditional way of life is being challenged, very high suicide rates. So this whole issue set, the Arctic Council, through its working groups, is trying to support the Indigenous communities. We have to find livelihoods and economic opportunities. And as you mentioned, when energy prices and if energy projects are changing, we have to give people purpose and meaningful employment. We have to start diversifying away from fossil fuels, using the digital economy. We have so much talent in these Indigenous communities. How do we bring that closer? How do we connect with that? And how do we support that? It is such an important issue for all of us, for all the circumpolar Indigenous communities, and certainly for our communities in Alaska.
Heather and John, that was sort of the perfect question to fill out and to bring us to our 1 hour mark. Thank you both so much for bringing this very important subject into a bright piece of sunshine. And I understand both of you have other ways that people could get information, so certainly going to the website and connecting with the radio program. I want to urge all of the viewers, you can get more of this direct information at the Global Minnesota website. There you can also access prior programs, other great discussions like these, and you can register for the next big thing, which is our World Health Day coming up on April 7th. It's something that the World Health Organization takes the global responsibility for coordinating. The theme this year, health equity, is something we're all talking about, whether it's global with vaccine or local disparities. But we'll also be hearing from representatives and people from around the world, from all continents, about how other people are tackling some of these issues. And check all of that out. And if you are not yet a member, we urge you to join. And if you are a member, of course, we thank you again for that support. John, Heather, thank you so much for joining us here, bringing us into a new way of thinking, but also giving us the inspiration and the real encouragement that we need to be informing ourselves. We need to be talking to our policymakers. We need to be remembering the Indigenous communities and thinking about all the multiple angles that we discussed this evening. This is a very important part of the planet, but maybe most important, it's a canary in the coal mine. It's a place where we can see, if we continue down this path without tackling these climate issues, the level of destructiveness that we could see. So thank you again for joining us this evening for Global Minnesota's Great Conversation. Have a good evening. Thank you again to all our viewers. Good night.